Middle Week. The theme this year, as you might know, is Continuum. Gerald is going to say a few words about that. But first I wanted to introduce both Joe Baker and Gerald Clark, who's coming right back, who are consultants to this program and have been for several years. And they help us plan and develop the concepts and ideas and help us select the speakers. And we have a great lineup this week. Did everybody get a copy of the schedule? Okay, and if not, they're right by the door. You can grab them on the way out. And after tonight's lecture, tomorrow there's a gallery opening up at Parks. There is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday lunchtime lectures. These are, you're all familiar friends, so I think you know the routine. You come and get your lunch, and we'll have food tastings again with Freddie Vitsui each day. In fact, and he's one of the lecturers. He'll talk about food over time. We have a fashion talk, and we have a special talk on Thursday by a young man who ran from Sherman Indian School 3 days, 90 miles back to his grandfather's home in Mesa Grande, and just this last winter to honor his grandfather who did that when he was trying to escape the boarding school. Anyway, so he has a story to tell, and and then on Friday, of course, we'll have, and then Thursday night we'll have films in here, some Native American films along that theme, and Friday we'll have the Bird Singers and a fashion show. We have 10 designers, actually 11, designers who are Native American coming with their looks, everything from streetwear to couture, some a little traditional, most not. It's a really interesting mix, and they're all established or new and up-and-coming designers. So that'll be a really interesting thing. And we have some professional models, but we also have some locals. So those of you who are local Idyllwild people, you'll see some of your friends modeling as well. It'll be a lot of fun. And then a reception afterwards with Freddie Vitsui's food tastings. So welcome. Oh, and here's Gerald and Joe. I think Gerald is speaking first about the theme.
Oh, sure.
Continuum.
Sure, yeah. Some of you look like you're big-time texters, so go ahead and turn off your phone. You don't have much coverage out here anyway, Ernest. Okay, so back last fall, before Christmas, I think it was, Joe, myself, Heather were shooting around emails. Oh, what should be the theme? And well, we've done this, and maybe we should look at that, or what have you. And through several drafts, this is what we came up with, and it's on the top of that little sheet there. So it says, this year's program, Continuum in Native American Arts and Culture, invites participants to consider current social or creative actions as the contemporary manifestation of an ancient expressive tradition, instead of looking at arts and cultures through the static lens of old versus new, traditional versus contemporary. And believe me, as a Native artist, we're fighting these battles every day. Lost versus preserved. The idea of Continuum offers an alternative view of arts and culture as ever-evolving aspects of human expression. And I can just tell you from my own experience that, I've made some, not enemies, but certainly not friends when I question the role of the word tradition. Because a lot of times that's being imposed outside of the culture. And so that versus, I have a problem with that versus there. Because I see what I do right along the same vein as what's been done for thousands of years, combining materials, making something that's beautiful and relevant to the culture. And 1,000 years ago, of course, Cahuilla is known for their basket making, deer grass, junkus, and that's what they did. And for me, it might be beer cans and kitchen sinks. The materials may have changed, but the thought patterns, the gathering, the assemblage, it's all basically the same. And those of you who are familiar with my work tends to be kind of crazy or kind of weird. And yet, we just finished our kind of traditional workshops doing quivers, arrows. This is a water bottle with cordage and netting and stuff. So for me, it's not a matter of 15 years at all. It is certainly a continuum. And so that's what we're going to be looking at this week. And I hope you can attend many, if not all, of the presentations. I'll shoot it to Joe.
Thank you very much, Gerald. Welcome, everyone. I'm Joe Baker. And as Gerald mentioned, throughout the year, we have a lot of fun and a little bit of stress when we sort of tease out these broad themes. And always we have the inspiration and the wisdom of our dear friend, artist Michael Kivati, who reminds us that we combine the trickster voices with the scientist and the intuitive. So we think we have a very special week ahead, and we invite you to check us out and give us a score, because I think you're going to enjoy it. Tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker, David Wells, and I'm thrilled to share with you some of his background. He serves currently as the director for Edgewood College in Madison, Wisconsin. Prior to this appointment, he served as executive director at Edenfred, the creative residency program of the Terry Family Foundation, developing the arts residency programs, a statewide forum for arts curators, and curating visual arts exhibits at Edenfred and for Sundance Cinemas Madison. He has pursued interdisciplinary interest as an exhibiting artist, independent curator, and arts administrator for over 30 years. Wells has been a frequent lecturer for the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art and has been a guest artist critic at UW-Madison and numerous other universities. He has been director curator for the Parks Exhibition Center and the Crone Museum here at Idyllwild Arts, as well as Ruth Bachhoffner Gallery in Santa Monica, Center Gallery of Indigenous Art, Idyllwild, California, and the Claremont Graduate University Galleries, Claremont, California, among others. Most recently, he has housed a textile collection of approximately 13,000 items into permanent visible storage for the Helen Louise Allen Textile Collection at UW-Madison. Please welcome David Wells.
Thank you. I know quite a number of you in the room and many new faces as well. My talk tonight is titled Context for Continuum. So I'm going to be talking about the context of the development of the school, the native arts here at the school, how that happened, and then looking at the continuum over time and many influences on that program and on the school itself. So that's sort of the general range of what I'm going to speak from. Much of that comes from my experience. I was the summer gallery director here in the mid-'80s through the early '90s when we moved, basically created a very small gallery displaying things for the first time to the barn where we did some much larger displays, and then I actually came back later to help people do new displays in the Parks Exhibition Center. So I feel a great affinity with the kinds of exhibitions that have gone on here in the summer. I also was the person who created the original museum here, organizing all of the things that the museum owns, the records, the artifacts, etc., and many of the photos to come to understand the history of the place, which actually is, to me, over time, as I've worked with those things, significantly different than many of the stories I've heard about that same history. So I found it very interesting to recreate from the records sort of what actually has happened. So the Idyllwild School of Music and the Arts was started by Max and B. Crone, and the first classes were in 1950. And they had purchased the land up here, and the campus area, the land they had purchased, had been the summer home to the native Cahuilla tribes in this area, and had long been sold through land grant interests, etc., and was then purchased from that family to become the school. Over time, they saw signs of the habitations, the acorn grinding stones and the rocks here that were very common, and felt that that was something they wanted to honor. And that fits in very closely with that. So here we have one of the sort of metodic grinding stones. Can we, how do we cut the lights? Or at least turn them down, something. So this is here on campus, one of the metodi stones, which, wandering around, you actually see quite a few of them. And here are Max and B. Crone, the founders of the school. And Max was in music at USC and a choral conductor. And B was an educator, and her particular interest was singing, particularly elementary schools. She did many, many songbooks for elementary school children about singing, songs, etc. And one of the reasons that they believed so strongly in the power of music and chose to create the School of Music and the Arts was that they felt, coming out of World War II, that music was the universal language. And if people learned each other's songs and each other's cultures, that you would have much better possibilities for peace in the world, and people would understand each other. And if you learn each other's words, you learn each other's cultures, and you learn who each other are as individuals and human beings. And so this idea came directly out of World War II, and the school started as a retreat for teachers. And it was for mostly elementary school, K through 12, but for teachers to come for a couple of weeks, and they sang songs, they did folk dance, they learned other cultures, the music from other cultures. All of those things were very important, and that's what happened here. And the first, early on in the history of the school, there were no children. There wasn't a children's program. It was all adults. It was all about sort of a rejuvenation during the summer and learning about the cultures. This is Bee's career with her songbooks. She taught rhythm and singing to elementary school teachers, and the songbooks all came with teachers' books to then teach how to do that. And her books were being published in the early 50s, and all of those books like Music Around Our Town, Music Across the Country, Music Around the World, gathered songs from cultures of many, many different places around the world. There are songbooks that are geared toward songs from Norway, songs from Germany, songs from Spain, songs from Latin America. And about the time, just earlier before the first classes were held here as they were planning the school, she had become friends with a woman named Adeloa, whom we will see very shortly. Adeloa was from the Chickasaw Nation and was an educator and a performer. And she did programs around the country that were about Native traditions and lots of different traditions. So she would talk about the lore of the different tribes, the different parts of the country. She grew up in Oklahoma, came out to Redlands, where her mother and brother were after her husband died. She went to school at Redlands, then went on to Columbia, got a master's, and worked for the Rockefeller Foundation, and started creating these programs that she then performed around the country to great acclaim and even internationally. So she was, at this point, the international representative for international exchange, or the field rep for international exchange in Los Angeles, and was working at UCLA. And she and Bee had become friends. And my speculation, although I've not been able to prove this, is that she became a contact for Bee to collect Native American songs for the books that she did, because she had songs of the First Peoples in books in the 50s, and would include the melodies and a little bit of the history about the songs. And so she was working, one of her books was Indian songs. And so I think she was working on this book with Adeloa when they became very good friends. And in the summer of 1945, Adeloa made a trip with Max and Bee Crone to Tuba City in Arizona. And Adeloa's English name is Mary Stone McClendon, by the way. And on this trip, I'm going to read just a short bit from a letter that this Max and Bee's son, Bob, wrote. And he wrote, Dad, Bee, and Adeloa drove to Tuba City, Arizona in the Navajo Hopi Joint Use Reservation area in the northeast portion of the state. From there, Adeloa took them to the site of the Hopi Ghost. It was night, and they huddled in their blankets for the exact time of that night of the year for the moon to burst and shimmer through the cracks of the rock formation to reveal the image known as the Hopi Ghost. Bee remembers that quiet vigil under Adeloa's guidance as a most inspiring experience. The next day, they stopped in Gallup at a large powwow, showing a lot of people showing their work, selling their goods, etc. There they met Ambrose Roanhorse and his wife Garnet, and invited them to come the next year to teach native crafts here at Idyllwild. So this was in 49, that would have been in 50, the first year. And they also met Martin Siostia and his wife, and they were Laguna, and invited them to come as well. So that was the initial impetus to bring those crafts here and introduce them into this multi-folk art, looking at the folk arts of all these different cultures and putting them on a par with others, if you will. Teata is another Chickasaw who was a cousin of Adeloa's, a younger cousin, and she also became a performer doing very similar kinds of things to Adeloa, and came and taught here. Both of them were here in 1950. That was the only year that Teata was here, but Adeloa continued teaching for many, many years. And the other things that we need to be thinking about, this is Ambrose Roanhorse, who was here in 1950 and 1951. Garnet. Martin Siostia, he was here in 1950 and 51, and from Laguna Pueblo. So if we look at this picture, a major criticism would be that this is not traditional Laguna wear. And this is the Sons dancing in 1951 as part of many other dances that were happening here. So I think the kind of idea here is also in 1951. So you have people, Native Americans, you also have music from India. So it's really trying to give a sense of the world into all of through music, to share the world through music. This is a crafts class. She taught Indian weaving. Basically, it looks to me like, inkle weaving, exactly. And you can see the different costumes that she has are from really different tribes, from different parts of the country, and so she would use the lore and stories of those different tribes to try and just explicate a wide range of Native American thinking. 1952, music from Japan. So again, this international kind of thing. Much of the influence, I think, on all of these things came from the folk music revival that started in this country in the 40s. Think Woody Guthrie, think those kinds of things. Much of it about labor songs, etc. And that folk music revival was about learning folk music from around the world and utilizing it in a new way to address the contemporary culture. Here's another campfire from Adeloa. I have several more pictures. Campfire from 1950. Adeloa's sunset ceremonies were famous on the campus. And she taught here from 1950 until 1963, all the way through every year. And if you talk, I mean, many of the people who were students here when they were young, it was one of the most moving things, one of the most inspirational memories that they have of being on campus were those evenings. And there was a path directly from here up to Inspiration Point, and people would take the path up and walk back down at night and sing down the sun. And so this was part of the ritual that she kept here and became a very important center for the campus. And it was very much in the spirit of B. Crone, and she and Adeloa were really great friends and really felt that that was an important part. You can see also, you know, the 4th annual folk dance conference and workshop. So there were folk dances from around the world, and they would bring things. There was square dancing, all of these other kinds of things. So it was not only one culture, is one of the, what I'm trying to sort of push here is that although there was a program, it was only part of this larger program at that time. An Adeloa Weaving class, 1962. A young Ernest Siva. And then here's a photo of Max Crone and Adeloa and Ernie, and I believe that is looking at a plaque that is about a grove of trees that are out here in front of Burchard. The plaque is still there. She created a grove of trees there.
That was a memorial to her. That's her sister.
That's her sister? Okay. This is what the records say it's her, so anyway, that's the, okay, so this is the plaque, that's the memorial to the grove of trees in front of Burchard, just across the way. Speaking about the American folk music revival, that peaked sort of in the 60s. Much of it was about the use of folk music to address contemporary culture. It was also about collecting songs before they disappeared. Sort of this kind of idea. Think Alan Lomax collecting all kinds of music around the country. His sister, Beth Lomax Hawes, was part of that. Pete Seeger was a big proponent in New York City, and Gene Ritchie, among others. This folk music revival, the movement brought many singers from a lot of different traditions together. And much of that begins with the career of the Weavers. And the Weavers were formed in 1948. It was Pete Seeger, Lee Hayes, Fred Hellerman, and Ronnie Gilbert of People's Songs, and Pete Seeger started that. People's Songs disbanded in 48-49, but it was about collecting labor songs particularly, and also, in particular, collecting labor movement songs from the CIO, which we think of AFL-CIO, but the CIO at that time was one of the few, if not the only union that was racially integrated. They had a big hit in 1950s with Goodnight Irene. Then there were a number of others. On the flip side of Goodnight Irene, which was on the charts for 13 weeks, was an Israeli song that concurrently reached #2 on the charts. So they were very, very popular. Other hits during that time, So Long It's Been Good to Know You by Woody Guthrie, Kisses Sweeter Than Wine. And so they were incredibly popular nationwide. However, their career ended completely abruptly because they were dropped from Decca's record catalog, and stations would not play them because Pete Seeger had been listed in the publication Red Channels as a possible subversive. So their engagements were canceled, their music was no longer played, they ended as a group. And folk music, which often has this sense of left-wing affiliations, especially during the 50s, during the Red Scare, was driven underground and carried along by sort of small released records. They were barred from mainstream outlets, and so they were restricted to performing in schools, summer camps, and the folk music scene became this phenomena associated with sort of a new bohemianism. And that then was in New York, it was in California, North Beach in San Francisco, and in a lot of college and university districts, all of those kinds of things. So this then went to sort of coffee houses and hootenannies, and the Weavers were the inspiration for many, many different groups. The Kingston Trio, then other artists like Joan Baez, Peter, Paul and Mary, Bob Dylan, etc. So why am I telling you all this? Because Pete Seeger was here. He was brought here. And as were many other folk groups, Jimmy Driftwood and Gene Ritchie. Some of you may not recognize these names. Gene Ritchie was basically responsible for the revival of the Appalachian dulcimer and Appalachian music. Jimmy Driftwood was sort of cowboy songs. Sonny Terry and Brony McGee were Southern blues, and they came up at this time. The Georgia Sea Island Singers were here. So the school brought in all of these different kinds of musical influences. So these are going on at the same time that Ataloa is consistently doing the Native American presence that these people then would participate in while they were here in this greater cultural sharing. Sort of a little sidebar to this is that in the same time in the 50s, we're now here in the later 50s, that the school also did contemporary dance. And they hired Bella Lewitsky, who had studied with Lester Horton, and Bella Lewitsky was blackballed because she refused to testify in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And Max Krohn hired her anyway. So there's sort of an interesting undercurrent at that time of, no, we will support people who are in the right through this belief in folk music and traditions and understanding other people's cultures. So I think that is something that is important for us to understand as a context for the early development of the school. Another early supporter was Meredith Wilson, who was up here. He was a very good friend of the Krohns. He was here nearly every summer through the 50s. He actually wrote a great deal of The Music Man on the mountain here and would try out the songs on the Krohns and get their feedback, etc. The Music Man then opened to rave reviews on Broadway in 1957. And then we moved to a new chapter. Ataloa was here until 1963. And after that, there was no Native Arts program on this campus from 1963 until 1974. During that time, we had a major upheaval in this country. And that includes the African American Civil Rights Movement. And that was going on starting in the 50s. You can see they would have black musicians here. Pete Seeger was part of that. Many people were part of that. Folk music was a huge part of that. All of those struggles. The Black Power movement then succeeded that in the 60s and 70s. But the Civil Rights Movement probably from about 55 to 68. Then in the early 60s, we have the Counterculture Movement. And the counterculture is in response in many ways to the Vietnam War. And it started first in the US and the United Kingdom, spread throughout much of the whole Western world in the 60s, early 70s. Many people involved in protest in Vietnam also were part of the civil rights movement. And all of these things were, many students and other people from the North were participating in all of these different kinds of activities. Also, at the same time, in this in-between time, is the Back to the Land movement. Started in the 60s, moving into the 70s. People were sort of tired of the urban and suburban lives. They felt they didn't have any touch with their food. And that these tensions, and going back a little bit to the counterculture, the things that ended up being divisions were race relations, and many of these became sort of generational differences between generations in the same family. So you had race relations, human sexuality, women's rights, traditional modes of authority. So people lost respect for government. In the younger generation, this is part of the whole counterculture. I mean, this is the sexual revolution. People were doing psychoactive drugs. So all of these things put together, new ideas about what the American dream was. And that influences what comes later. So the Back to the Land movement, you have consumerism, the failings of government, all of these things. The Watergate scandal, the energy crisis of 1973, these things all start fitting together. Another way to look at this is the kinds of things that were really, really popular in the culture, in the consumer culture that people bought. The Whole Earth catalogs were huge. They became this international phenomena, and it was about, what it was putting information together from biologists, designers, engineers, sociologists, organic farmers, social experimenters who wanted to create new ways of living together that were more humane, more close to the earth, all of those things. Does this sound familiar like now? A little bit? Anyway, so those things, the growth of Mother Earth News. Also, more applicable is the American crafts movement. The rise of American crafts. Much of this sort of a longer history that you don't need to know, but much of it came out of Black Mountain College, which was where many of the European intelligentsia artists ended up when they emigrated to the US to escape World War II. And that sort of then influenced two major art movements. One was the crafts, particularly weaving and ceramics, and two, the development of pop art. Those two things, because people like Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns came out of there, and other people went from there to studying philosophy, Japanese ceramics, and moving down these other kinds of spiritual paths and finding the use of clay to be the way to give physical form to a new understanding of spirituality. Those kinds of things and are really, really important. You also then had, after the 50s, and to throw in a little sidebar here, another statistic, in 1945 there were 55,000 televisions in American homes. In 1955 there were 55 million televisions in American homes, and it homogenized a culture in a really different way. And we think about, the social media now. I mean, think about that. People only had radio, and then suddenly it went to images. Those things made a difference. About the crafts movements, many, many people were going to college on the GI Bill, and also it became mandated during this same time that people had to take some kind of art appreciation course. And so you had more people exposed to different kinds of art forms than you'd ever had exposed before. Colleges and universities around the country, in this country, we did not have ever an atelier system where people would study with an artist. This was the norm in Europe. You would study with an artist, become part of their studio for a while, then go out on your own, or work in their studio for a very long time. We did not have that kind of tradition when those artists came to the US, so they found work within universities. Universities started creating these programs, and they put the ceramics and fiber on the exact same plane with painting, drawing, and so it became a really different environment, and all of the disciplines had to justify themselves in a new way with greater intellectual rigor because they were parts of universities. So this fits in as well, and a lot of people would go to those programs, and particularly fiber artists and ceramicists would, after graduating from those programs, just open their own studios. And it really changed how art became seen and consumed in many ways in this country. So that's one thing. Another factor is the environmental movement. That's happening at the same time, also in the 60s. The rising thinking of this, the Back to the Land movement is part of the same kind of thing. Feminism fits into here. The Gaia idea that the earth is our mother, all of those things fit into this new idea of a changing kind of spiritual understanding of the world that we're living in and how people want to live it. So, for instance, a couple of books that changed that early on, Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac was 1948. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was in the 50s about DDT killing birds. Paul Ehrlich, The Population Bomb, is in 1968. And all of these things really had an impact in the world at large. And so, for instance, 1964, the Land and Water Conservation Act. 1964, the National Wilderness Preservation Act. 1968, the National Trails System Act. 1968, the National Wild and Scenic Rivers System and the Wild and Scenic Rivers System Act. 1970, the first Earth Day. 1970, the Clean Air Act. 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency. 1971, Greenpeace was formed. 1972, the Clean Water Act. 1973, the Endangered Species Act. So all of these things are taking place. Also, you have all of this political activism going on all over, and all of these different parts of society. And it's not only the US, it's happening elsewhere as well. It's also happening at this same time. The American Indian Movement was founded in 1968 in Minneapolis with an agenda to focus on spirituality, leadership, and sovereignty. In 71, they gathered members from across the country for a protest in Washington known as the Trail of Broken Treaties. During that time, they gained national attention for seizing the Bureau of Indian Affairs National Office and presenting a 20-point list of demands to the government. And then this year, actually, 2013, happens to be the 40th anniversary of the 17-day armed standoff with federal forces at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. You also had greater movements across the nation to reclaim land, get compensation for the federal government for broken treaties. All of these kinds of things, a greater political activism and understanding is happening in native land as well. Also, you had popular culture books that really drew attention to and brought Native Americans into sort of the mass cultural thinking. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee was incredibly popular. It's still popular. It's been translated into 17 languages and just came out in reprint. Housemaid of Dawn by N. Scott Momaday, 1969 Pulitzer Prize winner. Touch the Earth, A Self-Portrait of Indian Existence, T.C. McLuhan in 1971. These were deeply influential books for a huge generation of people across, especially in the United States. Seven Arrows by Hayama Storm, 1972. Then you had the Carlos Castaneda books, sort of looking at indigenous culture in Mexico. Very, very popular. All of these books were mass sellers. So that changed or brought Native American thinking and approach to understanding of how they live in the earth to a far wider audience than it had ever been, who had ever been aware of it before. So these things all fit in. So, and they all happen between the time there's no Native Arts program here. So, for instance, all of this happens between 1963 and 1974, between Kennedy's assassination and Nixon's resignation. It's a very interesting little time frame. But for the next step here at Idyllwild, we have Kennedy to thank for that, because Kennedy created the NEA and the NEH, the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we have Richard Nixon to thank for all of those environmental treaties. So they both had their good points. So Susan Peterson. Susan Peterson started teaching ceramics here at Idyllwild in 1957, and she is probably one of the greatest powerhouses of ceramics in the 20th century. She created several ceramics programs, the most noted at USC. If you know contemporary ceramics, John Mason and Ken Price were her students. And she taught here for a very, very long time. She taught here for nearly 30 years. And Susan thought that it would be interesting. She was teaching, and of course being in a university environment. She wrote many books, but she was also interested particularly via ideas about feminism in the matrilineal potters of the American Southwest, the lineages of the Pueblo potters particularly, because that's one of the ways in which, in few ways, where women were the keepers of the money. The women were the keepers of the wealth, and that was a big issue with feminism. And so this was one of the reasons that she was interested in looking at that. She worked with someone at USC. First, she had met Maria Martinez as a young girl and had gone back and met her again to see her pottery, etc., and had become friends enough to ask if Maria and her son and daughter, Adam and Santana, and daughter-in-law Santana, would consider coming to teach here. They had never taught outside their village. They had done many demonstrations all over the world, but they had never taught anywhere else. And they said that they would consider it. She wrote an NEH grant, got the money to bring them here in 1974, which began a new iteration of a Native Arts program here at Idyllwild Arts. And so Susan went on to create ceramics programs at Hunter and other places, and just a nationally renowned treasure. And so Maria Martinez came in 1974, and then came from, I think, 74 to 78 or 9. I think it's on one of the others. And it was sort of an amazing thing. many, many people came to study with her because she's already world-renowned. And so studying with her really made a huge draw and really made Susan and others think, well, maybe there's more to do with this than we think. You know, maybe there are other things. And so 75 to 79. Laura Steer was, the Steer Studio was named after her. She was here very early on, and she and Maria were roughly peers. And so this is a very favorite photo here at Idyllwild Arts of one woman doing the bust of the other. And actually afterwards we could open the museum and you can see that bust is in the museum right down the hall here. Adam and Santana, this feather pot they gave to the school as a gift, and it's also in the museum. So then the next year, in 1975, in addition to the Martinez family, they added Navajo Weaving with Fred and Bertha Stevens and sand painting. You can see he's sand painting, she's teaching. And they taught here roughly until 1992, mostly Bertha. Not every year, but years on and off. And Fred Kivati was also here in 1975. And Fred Kivati is a bit of history renowned for painting the murals in the hotels at the Grand Canyon. And he also was hired by the US government to help create a sustaining way of making a living for people on the Hopi reservation. They created the Hopi Silversmith Co-op, and he and several others were responsible for creating what we know as Hopi overlay. Starting in 1979, when the Martinezes no longer came, Lucy Lewis came, and another Acoma potter, another Pueblo potter in the same tradition, the hand-building tradition, etc. So it's also interesting that you should know that two of the defining books, the major books about these two potters, are written by Susan Peterson. She wrote a book about Maria, and she also wrote the book about Lucy Lewis. And an additional book about Pueblo pottery in general. Lucy was assisted clearly by her daughters. And Emma and Dolores continued on and off again until 2005. So the school has a long history with certain potters. Blue Corn came in 1979. She was chosen by Maria. Maria recommended her as the person to replace her teaching here. And she then taught here for many, many years. Both the Lewises and Blue Corn did other in situ classes where people went and took classes in the American Southwest. That was a little bit later than this time. And then Tom Fresh, Susan continued to teach here, but gave over the Native Arts program so that it could grow because there was clearly interest among students. And so Tom Fresh became the head of that. He had been here in other capacities, working with the Native artists, etc. And he created the Mother Earth, Father Sky program. And he was doing that from 1983 to 1991. So in 1983, the Native Arts program expanded almost exponentially. It added weekend classes, it added in situ classes where people, instead of just studying with people here on campus, would go to the location, the native location. So for instance, the Lewises taught pottery at Chaco Canyon. And those kinds of things were happening. And that also showed a little bit of a more well-informed and an audience that wanted a greater experience than just coming here. They wanted sort of more of a real deal lived experience, which sometimes worked well and sometimes did not, depending on the personality of the individuals, but it was great. Juan Quezada, 1982 to 1991. Juan Quezada was known, he sort of basically recreated pots similar to the Casas Grandes tradition in Mexico, and then taught his entire village. And so it's known now as the Mata Ortiz pottery rather than Casas Grandes, but he revived a tradition. And this is something that then becomes more important, particularly during the Tom Fresh years. It began to be important to look at traditions and people who were reviving things from something previous that had almost disappeared or disappeared. And looking at, here we're talking, the continuum is how do you keep something going and reinvigorate a group's kind of spiritual relationship to their own traditions at the same time. These were discussions, and I think that things that were very important to think about at that time. So Juan did that, and then, as I said, taught an entire village. Here's a firing at that time. Michael Kivati came in 1983. His father, Fred, had been here, and Michael taught many, many different kinds of classes here over time. An accomplished muralist, painter, printmaker, and jeweler, known predominantly probably for his jewelry. A great spirit, and he became, in many ways, sort of an inhabiting spirit of the program for a really, really long time. And became dear to many, many people here on campus. And I think the place became dear to him as well. Paul Sufke was an elder, and Michael, in this case, was translating for him. Here's another photo of Paul, and he was doing Hopi weaving and taught weaving here, came a number of years. He also was one of the jewelers who helped start the Silversmith Co-op, and we have one of his pieces in the museum too. Bertha Stevens, this is a big photo of her during the 80s, as I said, here consistently for many, many years. This is a little bit later, probably later 80s, nearly 1990-ish. Art Thompson, Nootka, taught Northwest Coast mask carving. That was taught here on campus for a couple of years. But I'd like to go back just a little bit to thinking about what's going on in terms of the Native American Indian art market at this time. During the 80s, that market explodes. Suddenly, there are glossy magazines. American Indian Art Magazine comes out. It is sort of a mass buying thing. Many people go to Indian Market, really collecting all kinds of stuff. And the one thing about the program that was going on here is there was a conscious decision to work with people who are continuing the traditional life way. And so all of the classes that were taught here were from that point of view. And so it's people who are living and wanting to continue a traditional life way. So the arts are very traditional at this point, and they're really not contemporary in the way that the mass market was going and heading and did. Many of them got left behind. We also saw the transition running the summer galleries here from the artists who were very hesitant to give their work to anyone else unless there's an immediate cash transaction, to artists who were incredibly gallery savvy. And so that was part of the whole transition that you could feel and see here on campus from year to year. There were these slight differences. And because many of these artists came with their entire families, you could see the difference between the people who were teaching and the next generation. They were making other things. They were making things that were kind of the same, but still challenging assumptions about what those things were. And so it was really easy and to see those things visibly. Cahuilla basketry and culture. Catherine Sobel was very helpful here on campus and taught many workshops for us about culture, food, all different kinds of things, a lot of the plant lore, and was instrumental, I think, in elevating a public visibility for Cahuilla culture in this area. And one of the things that happened related to ISOMATA was the reinvigoration of a tradition of Cahuilla basket making. It had nearly died out. There were very few people that were doing it. Donna Largo had started learning when she was young and was trying to learn the traditional ways. Tom Fresh looked around. I mean, he sort of tried to uncover all kinds of things and finally found someone who had been a basket maker but hadn't done it in a long time, but said that she could do it. And so she created a basket, and this woman, Rosalie Valencia, then taught Donna the traditional starting way. And Donna continued that and became a fabulous teacher who taught here for many years. And so it was a sad loss. And but basically reinvigorated, worked very hard to reinvigorate a tradition. And Donna did that through classes that she started. And now we have Roseanne Hamilton, who's teaching here currently. And then in that same basket tradition, but in a very different way, we have Gerald's piece. Also, recreating Cahuilla-style pottery. Very difficult. Tony Soares is now doing that. We're thrilled to be able to continue these traditions and try and help teach these skills made from the local traditions and the local materials. The Cahuilla Bird Singers. Ernie's been instrumental in that. Hopi Pottery, again, another form that was dwindling at one time earlier, and we've had it here for quite some time now. Mark Tavo is our current person. After, and I think we're now showing this change from the time of Tom Fresh in 1991, then there was sort of another shift as leadership changed. Heather has been here since then, and so some of these people are newer that came in after that time. And I think one of the big changes that we have seen from that is that the program has become more, I would say, intellectually based in some ways. We are moving with both the I would say the student base changes, the interest base changes. Native American art is not nearly as hot a thing as it was in the mid-'80s, so there were fewer students. You can do different things with program. It's harder to find funding, all of those kinds of things. But the program has actually, I think, broadened in many ways too, and in that it addresses the larger cultural contexts directly, rather than, and multiple voices around those contexts, which is, I think, the theme this year is how do we address those voices? How do we address those, the differences and bridge them very easily? So, other shots from the class, firing. Lawrence and Griselda Sufki have taught here for many years. Lawrence taught Hopi jewelry with Michael Kivati. Griselda taught basket making. Other longtime Navajo weaving teachers, Barbara and Linda. A happy student. Richard Sosi, Navajo jewelry. And then the Native American Arts Festival week. This week began in 2000. So that has also really, I think, been a major influence in opening up and expanding a dialogue between the Native artists and between the archaeologists, the museum people, the back and forth. Everyone who has sort of a part of a sense of patrimony and a sense of the legacy and objects and care of objects, entering into discussion with each other has been a really, I think, newer and richer part of this program that does exactly what I think the program wants to do. As the dialogue and understanding of Native peoples within their own culture changes, and identities change, and how you think about your relationship to larger culture, rather than being enveloped and run over by it, how you participate in it. I think Gerald's work is a really good example of that. It's contemporary art, and yet it's Native American art. It's not separate. It's the same. And Native artists are part of the contemporary art dialogue. And it's not exclusively one thing or another. And it enlarges all of the dialogues. I think it's interesting, too, that with the idea of sovereignty, the Native arts, Native nations of the United States have been represented in the Venice Biennale since, I think it's 1998? So quite some time already. People organize those exhibitions separately, and so it's a very interesting kind of thing because they are a sovereign nation. They have their own exhibition at the Venice Biennale. Another one of the consultants, Patricia Crown, archaeologist. Native plants and food has grown a lot in the last few years as we've all become greater foodies and are paying more attention to where all of our food is coming from. It's a big discussion, and you'll be hearing more of that later this week about the history of native foods and how they've been collected, etc. Joe Baker, teaching beadwork here. Another approach to beadwork, less traditional. So I think you can see that we're trying consistently here through the program to widen the base of ideas, widen the look at what is happening within the art forms and people who are still traditional, but yet not so traditional. And Nathan Youngblood, again, another good example of that. Santa Clara Redware, again, the deeper carving. And more recently, during these week-long festival weeks, sort of Dustin Craig, a filmmaker, on your left, and on this side, Brett Michael Davids, who wrote the the music for the Last of the Mohicans, performing that here on campus. So looking to a wider array of how people are participating in the arts and larger culture. And I close here with a photo from Dancing Earth. This, I think, is 2007 they were here. And Rulan Tangam, the founder and choreographer. And so I think the strength of the program here is that it changes with the cultures on both sides. It changes with the culture of education, it changes with the cultures of students, it changes with what people want to do. It also changes with the dialogue from the Native American cultures and artists. What's the dialogue that they're having? What's the dialogue they want to have between themselves and the outside culture? And how do we encapsulate and keep all of that moving without alienating anyone and any side of that sense? And I don't mean that alienating in a sense of being politically correct, but without alienating in a way in which you're continuing to have a rich, honest dialogue. And I think that has been, to my understanding, the strength of the program here, and continues to be the strength of the program here. And I think that is a reason why it is still going and why it is still so strong and is so recognized nationally. So that's my little context talk. And then now we will hear from both Joe and Ernie. So I'm the long-winded one.
Want to stand up there?
Yeah, come on.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
For my second act, put it together.
It's broken. It hasn't broken.
Let's switch it up.
Sounds good.
This is all just to get your interest.
Part of the act.
I knew I had gained some weight, but I. Should we toss a coin?
How would you like to proceed, David? What would you?
Well, I think perhaps Ernie first.
Okay.
Talking a little bit for a few minutes about your sort of history with the school and what you have learned from that, because you've been involved for a really long time, and sort of has that dialogue between your involvement here been important and helpful?
Okay. Do we speak into this, or
Yeah.
you can hear
Or-
it probably? Well, I start by saying "good," Tommy Mukba. In our language, it means wake up, or get up. The sun is peeking at you. And that's what my grandfather used to say to us if we were still in bed when the sun was coming up. I had my awakening here, and I, like others, I suspect, who were my generation had become acculturated through public schools. We didn't attend the boarding schools as my mother had, where there were people were not allowed to think in Indian or talk or do anything in their culture. And so there was it was for assimilation, for acculturation, for changing the people to become mainstream Americans. And so when the kids would go home in the summertime, their families would, who were going along with government policies, wouldn't continue to talk or use their language or be Indian at home, so that the kids indeed became, they lost their culture, as you've heard about, I'm sure. But in my mother's case, we had the old saying from our great-grandfather, whatever you do, never lose your language. You have to change, but you should not lose your language, or else you'll be lost people. Never forget where you came from. That was what sticks in my mind. But that didn't occur to me as I was growing up, and I became a musician, and that's how I came here to Idyllwild. Dr. Crone came down to Banning in high school. I was a freshman and showed the film with about ISOMATA, and it looked like fun. Everyone was having fun. And the senior in our class had already been a camper in the band program. And he got us who were in the dance band to go up and play for the Saturday night dance. And so I got two callings there. I saw what a great place. I just can remember the smell of the pine trees. Where we live, we don't smell the pine. We have pine trees now, but where I grew up, it was different, and it was sticks in my mind. Everything was like a family. They cafeteria was right there at Bowman, and they would have campfires and gather around and talk about just stories, and that's where Idyllwild comes in. I remember, well, it was just a great time. But I was always a saxophone player, and that was about it. I didn't sing. The choir director heard my voice and said, "Would you like to sing tenor in the choir?" And I was so bashful. I couldn't, and wasn't used to hearing my own voice. I guess it was changing at that time. So I never sang, but I heard them sing. And so many things impacted on me. And I discovered that music of the strings, a mystery was solved. I had heard a kids program on the radio. All we had were radio before, on the res, battery operated. And my favorite programs were after school. And one was the Cinnamon Bear. It started out with string quartet. I had no idea what that was. It was the strangest sound I ever heard. And I was just enthralled with it. Came up here and that was it. It was a string quartet. And so it was just wonderful. I just can go on and on about the influence. Knowing my own background, my own music, I wasn't steeped in it as I would have been if that's all the experience we had at home. The ceremonials were only for the funeral times. That is, the old times were gone, of gathering and having bird singing. I didn't have that experience. So one hootenanny time, it was 1958 when Pete Seeger was here. He saw me leaning against a rock watching him sing. He was the MC. So he puts his banjo down, comes over while someone else is up there singing. He says, "Aaron, can you sing for us? Do you know any Indian songs?" And I couldn't think of anything to sing, or I was just caught flat-footed. So I said no, and then that really bothered me. Later, when I became a teacher, we needed music for enrichment, and I did draw on lullabies at that time, and that Crones were after songs for their books, and B. Crone learned that I knew some songs, that she was after me to get the Little Bear song and the Dragonfly song. And it never happened, though. It just didn't work out. But we did later get into the textbooks, songs from that I just mentioned, and other songs for children. But that's difficult in terms of having our music shared, because a lot of it is more private and would upset some people. I should mention Adaloa. I just recall that she was so, as you heard, such a performer that she could have you enthralled in any little movement. I remember she tells a joke about the two chiefs having a discussion, and I can't do it, but I'll try. One says, "Oh," the other one says, "Oh." "Oh." "Oh, oh." Why you change subject? Then she would sing the Zuni sunrise song, like the evening programs. It's a very famous song, and I play it on the flute now, and that's in my flute book, as well as the other songs I mentioned. But a little funny story about her. It was such a production. Her song was orchestrated, and Ralph Matesky, I think he orchestrated it for the high school festival time. And so it was a big production, the final concert, and they rehearsed, and concert is in session, and she starts out singing the song beautifully, but it's in not the key that is written for the orchestra. So we have atonal or polytonal music all the way through, and no one, everybody thought it was supposed to be that way. But those of us who knew better, it was amazing. Michael Thomas tells that story. So you remember when? Enjoy.
Thank you.
I have this odds and ends,
That's
So
great.
wonderful. Yes, wonderful.
I was, thank you, David, for sharing a remarkable history. I really kind of like the radical part. That's exciting to me. But in terms of, I want to go back to World War II, because, and I want to directly relate that to our museums and cultural institutions that we know of today. I think during that period, directly post-World War II, there was this rising affluence, the GI Bill, affordable housing, and all of those sort of new possibilities were open to American Indians in large part. And what we see beginning at that time are people like Lloyd Kivanoo, who was the first American Indian to receive a MFA degree from the School for the Art Institute in Chicago. We see George Morrison, who was actually running with the abstract expressionists in the Cedar Bar in New York. We were seeing jewelers such as Charles Lolema, who was really pushing design in terms of almost in a radical way that had never been experienced before, and experimenting with different metals. So really that becomes, as I see it, a foundation for a sort of a new progressive movement in native art. What I think is remarkable in terms of Idyllwild and its program is that, unlike some other institutions, Idyllwild has been able to be flexible and expansive and respectful of both traditions and new work. And, you know, I don't see that happening in some of our leading American Indian museums today. I'm seeing things almost in reverse. I'm seeing a very sort of structured and traditional presentation of native art. And I think here what is remarkable is that everyone sort of has an equal share in investing in what is that future and what shape that future will take. You know, it was quite, last year it was remarkable to be here with Jacques Soto, who is certainly an example of an artist who had a very unique experience within a tribal community and a very successful professional career in mainstream ballet. I'm also reminded of Brent Michael Davids, who was here also, what, 2 years ago? Who is a remarkable musician. And yet, all of those things are not considered outrageous or inappropriate or disrespectful, the art that they're making. I think, for me, I think artists make things happen. And I think that's universal. And I particularly love the idea, going back into the history, Ataloa and the beginning of Deep Croon, that whole notion that we were a world, the world view, and that we were people of many cultures, and that as people of many cultures we had unique voices, and those voices could be shared and exchanged. And that's what I'm seeing of great interest today to a younger, new generation of our contemporary native artists. They see themselves in the world view. And I think, you know, Friday, you're going to see an example of that with the fashion show. And if we reflect back to an earlier time in the 1950s, going back to Lloyd Kivanu, he had this remarkable studio in Scottsdale, Arizona, and he was at I think his handbags and his fashions were on the cover of Vogue magazine. I mean, he was a remarkable visionary, well ahead of his time. And so over this gap in time, now we're beginning to see native artists, you know, attain that kind of level of mainstream recognition and celebration. And that's certainly true with Patricia Michaels, who's coming, was just on
Project Runway.
Project Runway, thank you, yeah. So those are some thoughts that I've had in this evening. And I think, you know, mostly Idyllwild as a platform for the celebration of tradition, as well as an experimental laboratory for the new. And, you know, that to me seems to be the real strength of the program. It seems to be the energy behind it, and it seems to be the shape of its future, which, congratulations, Heather. Good job.
Thank you. We're probably a little over. Do we have any quick questions, comments?
I had a couple of things to add. Since I've taken part in the flute making workshops, this is my first experience with the Lakota flute, you know, the 5 or 6 hole flute that the Yazzie family makes. I was asked by them to teach the other students fundamentals of playing, and so I played bird songs, which is our music from here. But it didn't occur to me that by doing that, it's a great change from the traditional way of playing that Lakota flute. And it still didn't sink in until a professional flutist said it's a sea change. So it's that much. And it was simply accommodating the tunes that we have by creating different fingerings or partial fingerings covering the holes to make the tune. And so I think that and it happened here at ISOMATA. The other thing, an experience that I think a lot of individuals have from small towns. I'm from Banning, and I was a king saxophone player, you know, the best Beaumont, Hammett, you know, who came up here. I was just reading this book, Gifted Hands, by Ben Carlson, this great surgeon, brain surgeon. He, when he went to Yale, thought it was going to be like he did in high school. He was going to be the brightest one there. He found out that he wasn't. He almost flunked out. It's just what I felt when I came here, and these kids from Hollywood, and you know, their parents were studio musicians and all. It was a great boost, and that happens to all artists. When they see other people's work and what you know, you compare yourself, and you know that you have to grow. And I think that's such a wonderful thing. That's related to what we're talking about.
Sure.
Ernie, the story of you leaning against the rock and Pete Seeger asking you to sing a song is a wonderful story. I mean, just the image of the whole thing and that famous man and so forth. But you said you were embarrassed and that you did not know any songs. Was that what I heard you say?
Well, there were songs that I hadn't sung. Yeah, if you're going to sing in public, you want to at least sing it to yourself.
You did know some songs, but you just never performed.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But that started. It was a catalyst for me to start doing things. But the following year, I took up the guitar and was playing very simply and singing the bear song for Sam Hinton, who was MC then. Everybody thought it was great, and they heard the Indian song on the guitar. Max Crone recorded 2 of those songs and took them to when they went to Europe with the orchestra, and shared it with German musicians.
Just a comment. It didn't come up in the discussion, but Sally the other day here in the audience was asking me what I thought, what changes I had seen over the years. And the first thing that came to mind was, even though it's just in the last few years, is Native American participation at students and Native American tribal sponsorship. Some of our major funding comes from, you know, San Manuel, Cahuilla, Agua Caliente. In addition to the NEA, which continues, sporadically over the years, and a non-native anonymous foundation. But that's a big shift, that we get half of our funding from from native groups, tribes. And also that if you walked into the Navajo Weaving workshop this week, half the students were Navajo, who were here to work with Barbara and Linda And a couple of them were mothers and daughters. Cahuilla classes, flute making that Ernie teaches, easily half Cahuilla or from groups in this area. And I think that's a significant change. I think there are probably a lot of reasons that you could explain, but one is simply consensus. You know, there's more money to fund, and tribes are more empowered to decide what they want to support and what direction they want to go themselves.
And another thing that occurred to me about the in situ aspect of that Tom Fresh era, he said that the community where the artists operated, they didn't really uplift those or look highly at those artists until they became recognized by outsiders. When others came and could have made a big, to do of it, then the youngsters then took more of an interest.
May I say something about, I'm from Australia, and I went into the Navajo Weaving class and had a look around, and I just found that it is doing what you're saying, bringing in the traditional and the contemporary, and looking, for instance, at Marlowe's work. I was lucky enough to purchase 2 of his rugs today, and I think one is very traditional and one is starting to move into a more contemporary kind of finding his own voice situation, where it's still Navajo, but it's something more in some respects. And I feel very privileged that I've been able to come here, and as well as that, to purchase Marlowe's work. And that's all I've got to say on it.
Anything else? Thank you all very much for coming. Have a great week.
Thank you, David.
And,
Thank you.